Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. When I was initially requested to make this presentation, I was active in a think tank that I chair, the Institute for Integrated Development Studies, IIDS, who is also partnering with the EU in organizing this event. Since then, I have a new avatar as a member of parliament. So do forgive me for not making a detailed presentation. I do need to rush, like the finance minister, to the parliament to make some preparations. We have a new budget session that has just begun, and the whole entire topic is the economy. So in many ways, this is quite timely and relevant. Whatever we discuss here, the policy inputs, I welcome them and would be happy to table them on the floor of the House and also submit many of these proposals, recommendations for reform in the Parliament's Finance Committee, of which I am a new member as well. Let me touch, in the 10 or 15 minutes that I have, let me touch briefly on three aspects. First, the fundamental challenges of the Nepali economy right now. Second, on the status of EU-Nepal trade and investment the situation, and looking ahead to this decade, a quite important decade, not just from a Nepali perspective, but also from the many global milestones that we've set for ourselves. This is the decade of the SDGs, of course, because of the COVID pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A lot of the SDGs are now understood to have been derailed nationally, regionally, and globally. How do we get that back on track? This is also the decade of Nepal graduating from LDC status. How do we manage that transition post-graduation? And also our own internal ambition to reach a respectable middle income status. According to the World Bank definitions, we're technically just above the lower middle income threshold, but how do we reach respectable levels with a sizable economy and our prosperity that is broadly shared, start 30 million people. Now, on the current challenges of the Nepali economy, I mean, I was here yesterday also addressing another business summit, again, pre-scheduled program. So I hope people don't get the wrong impression that I have nothing else to do, but just come and speak at Yak and 80 every morning. But the four chasms that I highlighted, which I'll also repeat in the parliament today, how do you reconcile these four imbalances, right? On the fiscal account, just yesterday, as of yesterday evening, we've raised barely 723 billion rupees. The target was 1,400 billion rupees. So 2 months left for the fiscal year to finish. We've barely raised 52% of the target. Something wrong with the way we've been making projections on our national accounts and our fiscal ambitions as well. Even on the economic growth rate, the CBS told us the government had stated 8% annual growth rate. Where have we landed? It's okay, it's forgivable if you are off the mark by 0.5% or 0.7%. But to be off by 6 percentage points, there's something wrong there in our planning process. Either we are wildly optimistic or the shocks that we're facing are more adverse than we initially imagined. The second chasm is on the external account. Of course, the import and export imbalance is quite stark. If we didn't have the kind of remittance inflows that we do, we would already be in trouble. And this is actually the main topic of discussion today. How do we narrow those gaps? I'm not personally worried about bilateral deficits taken on a trade deficits taken on a bilateral level, right? It's the aggregate deficit that matters. So we may run a massive trade deficit with India or Bangladesh, for example, but we need to compensate that with surpluses elsewhere. And this is where I think we need to enter into a very constructive policy dialogue with the European Union, where both interests are secured and we are in a win-win trade and investment arrangement. On the monetary banking side, there's a lot of anxiety. Our own research led by Biswas Gauchan at IIDS has shown there's almost a very flimsy link between this massive credit growth and real economic growth on the ground. So we've witnessed on average over the last 15, 20 years, credit expansion largely fueled by massive remittance inflows of 20, 22%. That means credit expansion has been happening every 3.5 years. I mean, it's been doubling every 3.5 years, but that's not quite translated into real economic growth. Nominal expansion has been around 10, 11%, but real growth has hovered around 3, 4%. This year, as I mentioned earlier, is less than 2%, right? So where is all that money that we've been pouring in gone? And this is where I think we need to take a deep stock taking. Initial hypothesis, as many of us are aware, very unproductive real estate speculation and massive imports of consumer goods. That, I believe, has not really helped us build a durable base and foundation for a productive, competitive economy in the future. So we might have very well squandered an important decade in terms of precious, scarce foreign exchange reserves. That doesn't mean we have to look back and sulk. We have to look forward and plan ahead, course correct. And this is where the Parliament's current session is exceptionally important. What kind of policies are we producing? So this week, for the next few days, we'll be discussing the principles and priorities of the government. After that, the policies and programs of the government, and then the budget itself that is expected at the end of this month. So if the finance minister had the patience to hang around for a bit, I would have told him that we have high expectations from him. And from our side, from my party, the RSP, we stand ready to serve as a very constructive opposition and also provide substantive inputs. And also the fourth chasm that I highlighted yesterday is also this gulf between consumption and production, which is reflected very much poor economic growth, low pace of real and productive employment generation, tax base not really widening much, etc. So this splitting of the macroeconomy, fiscal account, the external account, monetary account, real account, there are problems on all these. And I'm not going into a theoretical discussion on how each of these accounts are linked and what one might reinforce the other, but there are basic problems. I think our path to reform starts by acknowledging that we're in a deep problem. Hence the importance of economic reforms, a credible government bringing issues. Now, the second set of issues regarding EU-Nepal thing, I think a few months ago, I had the opportunity to address the EU-Nepal trade and investment situation in the context of LDC graduation. And I do see that there's a very rich program ahead of us, and I urge all the participants to stay around and benefit from the insights. My own takeaway is that EU has been an exceptionally good development partner to us. We are indeed tied by common shared values, open liberal democracy, competitive economy, celebration of pluralism and diversity, etc. So on the bedrock of those shared values and principles, I think there's much to build upon. But unless we have a durable economic partnership going, all the others are limited to platitudes and statements. And this is where we need to do the hard work in adding substance to our relationships, building on those shared values and principles. Our exports to the EU stands at around $75 million. I think we should be doing much more. We should be doing much better. Right now, the problem is on our side. It's largely internal supply side capacities that is deplorable. We have our own excuses, as you might have heard, conflict, post-conflict transition, constitutions. A lot of the political agenda has trumped our economic priorities for a long time, but we no longer have that choice to squander the coming few years where we will continue to enjoy this demographic dividend. So we need to get our acts together. But my own hope is that through many of the reforms and new forms of partnerships, even after LDC graduation, we would be able to see at least $1 billion of exports to the European. And that kind of ambition would then do justice to the already very positive relations that we have. This has also fluctuated quite widely. Looking at the data between 2013 and 2018, we're picking up. Average growth was around 8%, but because of COVID, that slumped, and we are yet to reach to pre-COVID levels. $75 million is not much. It's only 3 days of remittance inflows for Nepal. If you see from that perspective, that also tells you that we need to be doing much more. In terms of partner countries, Germany, of course, is our most important partner. It's around $30 million of exports, which is, again, 1 day of remittance inflows into Nepal. So from that perspective, I think I'm not disparaging the amount. I'm just highlighting, making this comparison to drive home a sense of urgency that we ought to be doing much more on this. And in terms of products, I think carpets and shawls and felts and other light items is what we've been exporting. And this is actually in the right direction. We don't have the competitive edge to mass produce bulky items that then needs shipping from Kolkata to world markets. The higher value to weight ratio is what we need to be following. And this is where, and I do see in the program that there are certain stalls here, high value coffee and other items, tea, ginger. In Germany, I noticed that through German investment that we've done pretty well in exporting Timur, Szechuan pepper from Salyan. And I was delighted to see these tiny bottles worth €9 and €10. And that's exactly the kind of model that we should be following. But it needs to be done at scale. The quality needs to be consistent. And this is where I think we expect much more support from the European Union on strengthening our internal capacities, the labs, the issues of accreditation, certification. And this is where actually Nepali entrepreneurs might be confused sometimes. It is difficult to navigate the big complex regulatory regimes in each of those European countries. So this is where FDI becomes so important, right? You bring the know-how. It's not so much the money, but you bring a ready-made market, you bring that know-how, and you bring your networks, contacts, and then through the goods that we are able to process, create value here in Nepal. I think that's the kind of partnership that we ought to be following. There are early good signs. Actually, 15 or 20 years ago, I was very encouraged. I think there was a GIZ project that is focusing on tea, on bamboo shoots, and other 4 or 5 items. And unfortunately, I think because of our own internal problems, that sort of fizzled away. But let's revive. I think that's where the hope is. That's where the potential is. And now, increasingly, you also need to jump into the services sector. So if you break down tradability of services according to the modes, mode 1, business process outsourcing, etc., where suppliers are here right in Nepal, but the consumers are in the European Union. With digitalization and policy liberalism, that is now increasingly possible. Our doctors and accountants and architects and IT folks can stay right here in Nepal, serve the European market. That's already happening. We need to give it a big boost. On mode 2 is the issue of tourism, where consumers from Europe travel to Nepal and consume those tourism services here. So how do we make that an important priority going ahead? I know there are issues with aviation links, etc., but let's do what it takes, what it would take to really open up those skies, bring European tourists into Nepal in massive numbers. That's possible in Sri Lanka, that's possible in Thailand, it's possible in Vietnam. Why can't we attract a fragment of that massive inflows from Europe into Asia in Nepal? So that's very important. On the third mode, which is producers or service providers coming to Nepal and locating here, roughly equivalent to what we call FDI. That's also, that's an area that I hope we will make much more progress on. And the mode 4, where our supply providers travel to Europe. This is a bit tricky, immigration-wise, etc. But in terms of short-term temporary migrant laborers, which I hear is already happening, make it more systematic, make it more legal, address European concerns that these folks don't stay behind and become a burden to the host societies. But if we can arrange those short-term visas for temporary movement of labor into European countries, I think that would also be very beneficial to us. So firing on all engines when it comes to tradability of services, I think that's an agenda that we need to work much more on. On the investment front, I think it's, again, like on the trade story, it's not terribly exciting. About 5,500 projects. EU accounts for about 10% of projects and 7% of jobs. Again, the message here is we could be doing more. We should be doing more. Now, on the European side, I was with the Austrian ambassador yesterday, Rajesh Babu Shrestha. It's a big success story on transfer of technology. All these fancy, safe, quite elegant cable cars that we see all around Nepal now, it's a European technology, right? So those kind of things that we can't do on our own, that we need to borrow off-the-shelf technologies or even advanced technologies that we need for our industrial upgrading, we count on the EU. But it has to be affordable. And this is where some intellectual property issues come in. are there ways through global, regional, bilateral arrangements where some of these technology transfer mechanisms can be made much more affordable, accessible, and this is where sort of the concessional window for funding many of these transfers is also going to be very, very important. And this is where both of us need to sit around the table and do some homework on the next level of deepening our economic partnerships. It has to be win-win. It has to be win. Now, on the final set of comments on way forward. So there's a lot of anxiety around post-LDC graduation. I've been trying hard to hammer home the point that this is all exaggerated and possibly driven by very narrow, petty interests on the part of a few individuals. We can sit around the table, look at the data, look at what the provisions call for, and prepare for safeguards. But overall, I think this is a good thing for Nepal to graduate out of LDC status. There is a transition period in place, and rather than waking up in November 2026 and saying, "Oh my God, all these preferences are gone," there's still a lot of time to prepare for. But the point is, we've not been able to enjoy or utilize the many preferences and the benefits that were on offer because of our own internal weaknesses. And even after graduation, there are mechanisms where we can continue to benefit from EBA-like provisions. So going on to the GSP, but these things are conditional. All the conventions that you've heard about, I think we have 1 or 2 conventions to ratify. They're all in our interest. It's about freedom of association, etc. Trade union movement, perfectly aligned with our democratic values and indeed our universal commitments. So, covenants and conventions that are in our interest, which has been placed as a condition for eligibility into participation for GSP plus provisions of the European Union. I think we should just prepare, have a constructive dialogue, and get ready for that elevated participation in another EBA-like regime. To the extent that is possible, our European partners will be sympathetic to our conditions, sympathetic to the development stage we're at, and I'm sure in terms of arranging liberal rules of origins, extending some transition periods on a case-by-case basis, which is something that we're negotiating at the WTO as an LDC club, for example, relating to TRIPS and the pharmaceutical products. I think that's very much possible. And the spirit of partnership, I think this is something our foreign policy establishment, our finance establishment would be able to take forward. But the big elephant in the room is internal. It's internal. It's our problems, right? So how do we build these productive capacities? How do we make sure that we have an enabling environment for global value chains to invest? India, there's a lot of activism, engagement on the part of European countries in India. Prime Minister Modi has been courting European investors in a massive way. So our way to Europe could be through India and China also, right? So how do we leverage those ties? We have an LDC pact with India under SAFTA as well as a bilateral arrangement. And sometimes it might make sense for European companies to locate in Nepal and engage in trade export relations with the larger neighbors, other rising parts of Asia. So that kind of staging, that kind of trading arrangement is also something to be considered, especially from the perspective of utilizing our clean energy, thereby helping yourself brand in an era of climate change, how that might come into the fore, cheap, disciplinable labor force, etc. would be very important. Also on development financing, we need to be much more creative, innovative in how we leverage development financing going forward. Grants as a share of development finance has been shrinking. Loans are somewhat concessional up to this point, but it will increasingly be non-concessional as we go up the income ladder. So how do we leverage new sources of finance on offer? Climate finance, green finance, at least $100 million on the table right now if we do our home. Right? Countries like Mongolia have been utilizing this in a very proactive way. In Nepal, again, for our own internal problems, we've not been able to catch up. There's something called the Bridgetown Initiative, initiated by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, very active on these fronts. And I was looking at the population of Barbados. It's 281,000. I just got elected from a constituency in Tonahu. The district of Tonahu has 315,000 people. So here's a country smaller than my constituency, which is leading the world on many of these issues. debt for nature swaps. So we need to come out of that box and be much more creative, innovative in leveraging new sources of finance. Of course, our problems with absorptive capacity, etc., is also there. So let me end with just 2 or 3 simple messages. What we have is great. The relationship, the civilizational ties, values, bonds. Let's build it further, consolidate it, but use it as a base to also to sort of generate more substantive economic gains for our people. And this is where we need to up the game, kind of trade and investment partnerships that we forge ahead. And as both EU and Nepal as stakeholders in the World Trade Organization, shared stakeholders in the United Nations system, Bretton Woods systems, I think there's a lot of common agenda when it comes to development finance, new sources of finance, and cooperation that we're working on. So thank you so much. And any inputs, the sort of policy issues that you would like us to raise in the